should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Welcome back, folks. Dr. Gurr, I remind you that you're still under oath. Mr. King, you may proceed with your direct examination of Dr. Gurr.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, we were talking about the August 5th, 2014 visit that you had with Mr. Holmes. And did you discuss with Mr. Holmes the his meetings with and treatment by Doctors Fenton and Feinstein at that time?
I did.
And are you aware from reviewing the records from Dr. Fenton and Feinstein that Mr. Holmes reported on his initial assessment with the social worker, Margaret Roth, and his first contact with Dr. Fenton and throughout their treatment, that he had these intrusive thoughts of killing a lot of people?
Yes.
On August 5th, when you discussed that with him, did he indicate to you that he was expecting that the therapist would be able to fix those thoughts?
Yes, his word, they will fix it.
Now, Mr. Holmes didn't tell Doctors Fenton and Feinstein exactly what his plans were, specifically to what theater he was going to, or when, or any specific details like that. In your expert opinion, was he making a choice not to tell them those things? Or was his choice restricted somehow by the psychotic delusion itself?
I believe that he was restricted by the psychotic delusion. He was guarded all along and did not share or provide details of his experiences, any of the experiences we went over to family members and the details to anybody else. His fear was that he will be identified as somebody with serious mental illness, and he will be locked up and his life will be over.
And would that prevent him from accomplishing the mission?
He will not be able to accomplish the mission.
The last visit that you had, the last couple of visits were in November, I think the 18th and the 20th, or the 19th and the 20th of 18th and the 20th of November 2014. Was that the last time times that you met with Mr. Holmes? Have you met with him since then?
I have not.
At that point in time, did he tell you about the psychotic process and how it took place, whether it escalated over time, or how did it go from abstract to real? How about that?
He described that for a long time his thoughts were abstract. Namely, it was only a thought and there were no specific details to it. Just the thought that he was able to block, just the thought popping out of killing people. And then it moved to, again, abstract thinking about a nuclear bomb, that he realized that this is not something that is an option. And then he began to think after articulating it to people and talking about it, it became to think in more detail of what steps he need to take to accomplish his mission.
Does that seem consistent with your experience and understanding of how delusions can develop over time?
Yes, yes.
Delusions, I think you said, can take months or even years to develop. At what point do you think Mr. Holmes became actively psychotic? I know that you said that you thought there were glimpses of it as far back as high school or undergraduate school, but when do you think he became, when was the first break? Can we put a date on that?
So it's extremely difficult to put a time on a first break. It's a fluid process that varies from one person to another. It can take weeks and it can take months till it's become obvious to the outside. I believe that the turning point began deterioration after the winter break, when he came back from his vacation, from his Christmas break. So this began more, it's like from being little blips, it rose up a level to more severe preoccupation, more severe anxiety, more severe depression, more difficulties that he experienced with school, decrease in sleep, the thoughts became more frequent, and the call for action became something that he felt compelled to do.
May I approach the exhibits, Your Honor?
Yes.
Now, Doctor, did you review a Gmail chat between Mr. Holmes and his Ngargi Dada, which took place on the 25th, I believe, of March 2002, where he described...
Did you mean 2012?
2012.
Oh, 2012, yes, thank you. Did you review that Gmail chat where he described having thoughts of killing people and talked a little bit about those subjects with Ms. Dada?
I did.
And was that psychiatrically significant to you?
Yeah, I believe that it shows the evidence of his psychotic process. She's asking him questions about him as a sane person, to inquire of why does he want to do it, and how he shouldn't do it because life for him is worthwhile. You should think about the positive things in your life, and in graduate school, and he's already deteriorated, engulfed in his delusions, and attempting to explain to her of why does he have to do it.
Is that the first time that you noticed that these delusions really became kind of crystallized or expressed by him explicitly to someone else?
Yes.
And did he say something to you about how saying it made it real, or something along those lines?
Yes.
Can you explain what significance that had?
He said that as long as the thoughts were in his head, they were just thought, that he could work on controlling. But once you say something, you have to pursue and do it. So telling it to Gargi was the next step, because it has to be done. When something is verbalized, it has to be done. And this is very psychotic level of thinking, that sometimes children think this way. If I wish somebody dead, maybe they will die. It's a really distorted and regressed level of thinking, especially for somebody with his level of intellectual functioning. Why, if you have to say something to Gargi, who was your girlfriend, it means that you have to follow up, because it becomes real. Words, when articulated, are real. They have to be followed up with action. There's no going back once he said it.
Is that a delusional, a psychotic thought?
It is a psychotic process. Healthy people don't think this way. They can say, I'm sorry I told you, I thought about it again, it was just a thought. They don't feel, I said it, I have to pursue it. There's no going back.
Is that logical?
No, totally irrational level of thinking.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't know of any healthy people who think this way. When I said something, I mean, it's not like you promised to somebody, I'll be there at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, or I'll buy you a present and then you have to go back. You're talking about, I find it difficult to find words to explain it, about something that is like, so tragic that, without being able to retrieve what you think and what you do, but feeling so compelled to follow up on.
When you talked to him about this process that was unfolding on the 20th of November 2014, did he indicate to you whether he thought that the mission made sense and was logical at the time?
It was logical to him at the time. It was totally logical to him. And within his distorted perception, this was the next logical step that he needed to take.
During that session with him, did you also discuss the medication, the SSRI or the sertraline, the Zoloft that Dr. Fenton prescribed to him, and how he felt that affected the mission?
He reported that the sertraline decreased his level of anxiety. And with the reduction of the level of anxiety, it freed him to put more energy into the mission.
Did you have an opinion about whether that's a possibility or not? Could sertraline have contributed in some way to his mental illness or the decreasing of fear?
Yes. The objection is sustained. think your mic might be, is your mic on? You're welcome.
Reviewing the documentation, the records from Dr. Fenton and Feinstein, is there evidence of psychotic level thinking contained in those records and the statements that Mr. Holmes made to them?
There was a concern on their part that the psychopathology or the psychiatric symptoms that he is exhibiting and describing to them might be on the verge of psychosis. And they considered the possibility that this young person might be moving towards psychosis, and considered the possibility of treating him with an antipsychotic medication.
How is that significant, the fact that they were considering an antipsychotic medication?
It reflects on the concern with the information that he was providing them and their observation that that there was something, a potential serious process going on, and that need more serious treatment.
As a psychiatrist who treats clinical patients, inpatient and outpatient, is it a red flag when a patient comes in to you and says, I'm having homicidal thoughts of killing a lot of people?
Yes, it is.
Does that demand some kind of follow-up, in your opinion?
Yes, it does.
Sustained.
During your final interview with Mr. Holmes on the 20th of November 2014, did he describe to you hallucinations that took place during his lab rotation after Christmas, describing a small person or persons juggling balls or heads, or not?
Yes, he did.
Is that consistent in some ways with the information provided to Dr. Reed in the videotaped interview concerning shadows and juggling and things like that?
It is.
Now, in addition to the chat that you talked about with Gargi Dada and the treatment by Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, did you think it was significant, the text message, if I can approach the exhibits, Your Honor?
Yes.
That Mr. Holmes received, the exchange he had with a classmate named Hillary Allen early in July 8th, 2012.
Yes.
And do you remember the phrase that he used there concerning the floodgates?
Opening.
And what in your mind was the psychiatric significance of that as a marker of where along the psychotic process he was at that point?
Well advanced at that time. And some, within describing a process that is dynamic, and in evolution, it was progression.
Do you have an opinion about whether this psychotic process that you said there were glimmers of as far back as high school or undergraduate school, but that really began in earnest after the first of the year in 2012, did that continue throughout 2012 and into 2013? And
2014 and 2015.
His admission to the hospital, Denver Health Medical Center, in November of 2012, is it consistent with the fluid nature of psychosis that that would happen at that time? I mean, why didn't something like that happen earlier in August or October or September? I mean, does that mean he was not psychotic throughout that period?
No, it does not. As I said, the psychotic process is dynamic and fluid with ups and downs, and at times when in a structured setting without having to meet many people, peers, or present, makes it easier for people. So in some ways for him, being in prison and do what he needs to do within a structured setting made him feel more comfortable.
So you're saying it was more comfortable to be in jail?
To some extent, yet. You know, when I asked him, what would you like to do when you're not in jail? He lost his freedom, he doesn't like that. I will play computer games and maybe look for a relationship. What do you hope to get from a relationship? Well, it will be novel. Well,
Do you have an opinion about whether it was the psychosis that in November caused by the crime? I mean, just going into the theater and shooting people, would that cause someone to become psychotic for that duration of time?
no, the psychosis existed before the crime. The crime itself and the follow-up to the crime can at times exacerbate, but it is not that the crime created the psychosis. He was psychotic when performing the crime.
How about the incarceration? Did that cause the psychosis, him being locked up?
I don't believe in his case, when you look at the total picture, that it has caused the psychosis.
Based on the totality of your interviews with Mr. Holmes and all of the information that you reviewed, did you formulate an opinion as to what the diagnosis Mr. Holmes suffers from and suffered from on July 20th, 2012?
Yes,
And what was that diagnosis?
schizophrenia.
And what was the basis of those opinions?
The presentation over time, my direct observations of him, the information obtained from him, the review of the records, other professionals evaluating him and reading their notes and reviewing the records or videos, the totality of all the information is outlined in my report. If you look for the diagnosis, and that's what we do. We look for a diagnosis that can put it all together, all the information that is available. And in my professional opinion, it is schizophrenia. All the characteristics of schizophrenia were present at the time of the commission of the crime.
Do you have an opinion about whether your diagnosis is consistent with the diagnoses of the other psychiatrists that have examined Mr. Holmes?
I believe that there is consistency, while some have not called it schizophrenia, but schizoaffective, and some who have seen him at the hospital called it psychosis NOS. By and large, there's this agreement that a serious psychotic process was affecting Mr. Holmes, that he was mentally ill with a psychotic process.
And is that true of Doctors Woodcock and Metzner and Reed as well?
Yes.
Is that, in your mind, a fairly remarkable congruence of opinions? Or not, considering the evidence that's before you?
I think that in such, I'm trying to think about the brief answer, is that given the level, the expertise and experience of the professionals who have seen him, I'm not surprised. But it is remarkable that given the circumstances and the complexity of the case, that we have formulated a similar approach on both sides of the aisle.
I have a couple of questions that I forgot, and I probably will have more. But you were talked about freezing, and this freezing that happened to him from all the way back in high school, and it's described in Dr. Reed's videos as well. Now, is this something that, I mean, is this, maybe this is obvious, but maybe not. Is this like a physical freezing? Like Mr. Holmes, when he gets around other people, does he like freeze up, like he can't move physically and become like a statue? Or is this a mental process due to the fear he's feeling in his mind?
It's the second. It's a mental process. So he can experience it while walking, but inside have such an intense level of anxiety that he cannot attend to other things, and feels his heart will be beating fast, he will have difficulty in breathing, and it's sort of a doom, feeling of doom will come over somebody who is freezing. It's an emotionally very negative experience. It's almost you feel like you're choking, the need to breathe air, almost like you are drowning. And in this case, drowning in fear is the way that describes it. Of people who are walking next to him and are barely paying attention to him. You know, kids in school walking down the hall will induce this level of fear, of freezing.
Did Mr. Holmes tell you during your interviews with him at some point that when he, after he dyed his hair red and bought the gear, that at some point when he was taking selfie pictures, that he looked at himself in the mirror and said that he felt like something had taken over him, like a master power?
Yes, he did.
Now, did you follow up on that?
I asked him, and the master power was the call for action, like a power, a need to pursue what he was doing.
So was it, when you followed up on that, was he talking about like some kind of, like a god or like a demon or something that was controlling him, possessing him like that, or?
No, it was not. It was just a different way to describe the call for action.
Did you get a chance to review, as part of your analysis, a video that was taken by two defense investigators of Mr. Holmes in the hospital on the 20th of November 2012, the day before he was released from the hospital?
I did.
Have you had a chance, did you review that when you got the materials in the past?
I reviewed it in the past and reviewed it again.
Your Honor, what exhibit number are we up to?
Well, those two exhibits have been marked. Are you asking about the disc? It's marked, I think, D-TR-79.
Yes, Judge, I am. CTR-79.
Oh, okay, C, okay.
CTR, so
Okay.
this is another copy
Okay.
that she's reviewed. Do you want me to use that copy, or does it matter?
Why don't you mark a different copy?
Okay, I've done that.
All right,
And what are we up to? What defense exhibit number are we up to?
97.
97. I'm marking that now, and I'm showing that to counsel. Ma'am, I'm handing you what I've marked as DTR 97. Do you recognize that disc?
Yes, I do.
And have you reviewed that specific disc earlier on today?
Yes, I did.
And does that disc contain the same video that you reviewed before is it an accurate representation of the same video you viewed before of the two defense investigators speaking with Mr. Holmes in the hospital on November 20th, 2012.
Yes, it is.
Is that something that you used as part of the information that you based your opinions on in this case?
Yes, it is.
Is that the kind of information, namely someone asking an individual who's been hospitalized for psychosis questions about what they've experienced over the past day or two in terms of their hallucinations and other things, is that the kind of information that you and other psychiatrists would regularly rely on in determining, in making these decisions about diagnosis, etc.?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, at this point, I'm going to move for the admission of DTR 97.
Is there any objection, Mr. Brock? Yes. All right, members of the jury, I have decided to defer ruling on that exhibit until tomorrow. You may proceed, Mr. King.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, did you explore with Mr. Holmes this hatred of humanity that he had? I don't know if we talked about that before, but did he describe it? How did he describe this hatred of humanity that he wrote about it?
Your mic may be off, Mr. King.
Let me try this again. Did you hear me, Doctor?
Yes, I did.
Okay, I was asking about the hatred of humanity that's written in the notebook. Did he explain to you about that?
What he said, there was, and I quote, a little hatred toward people. Why? I asked. What is the nature? They made him feel anxious. But he did not express hatred toward people as part of the mission.
Did you note in Dr. Reed's videotaped examination that when he asked Mr. Holmes about this, he described it as being an intense aversion, like hating broccoli, as opposed to a fiery hatred?
Correct.
Is that consistent, in your opinion, with the way he described this hatred of mankind to you?
Yes, although he didn't use broccoli.
Were you also asked to render an opinion as to whether Mr. Holmes was legally sane or insane on July 20th, 2012? Was that one of the questions presented to you?
Yes.
And did you review the relevant statutes for the state of the law with regard to insanity in Colorado?
I did.
And were you able to understand those statutes?
I did my best.
And I don't mean to be insulting about that.
No, I understand. I understand. I believe so.
And have you formed an opinion about, first, whether Mr. Holmes suffers from a mental disease or defect?
Yes.
And what's your opinion about whether Mr. Holmes suffers from a mental disease or defect?
I believe that Mr. Holmes suffers, at the time of the commission of the crime, he suffered from a serious mental illness, a mental defect that have impacted his behavior during the act.
Okay. Now, you've diagnosed him with schizophrenia. Does everyone with schizophrenia insane, in your opinion?
No.
Is everyone who suffers from a delusion insane?
No.
Does it depend on the depth and the nature and the pervasion of the delusion and how it affected the person's ability to understand morality and the difference between right and wrong?
Correct.
Can you divorce such a delusion from a person's thought process? In other words, once it's ingrained, is it such a part of the brain that it can't be divorced?
Correct. It becomes a prominent feature in brain function that directs behavior that is pertinent to the delusion, not other behaviors necessarily.
Have you formed an opinion as to whether Mr. Holmes' mental disease or defect rose to the level that it rendered him incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong on the 20th of July, 2012?
I did.
Do we have a date prior to that when you think it started that he could no longer distinguish between right or wrong, or is that not what you're asked to answer under the law?
I focused on the date of the commission of the crime, on July 20th, 2012.
Now, a lot of the things that you've talked about this delusion, was that it was compelling, that he was forced to act by the delusion, that he had no choice. Now, is that the standard in Colorado for insanity?
No.
Is it relevant, in your opinion, to his ability to distinguish between right or wrong under a societal moral standard, whether or not he was compelled by this delusion? Is that a relevant issue to that question?
Yes, it is.
How so?
Engulfed in his delusion, other considerations that commonly affect us, healthy people, in considering what is right and wrong were not part of his deliberate decision process. The part that was in front of him and pushed him, mobilized him forward, was the mission that needed to be accomplished so that he can incorporate the value of other people into him, and his worthless value because of his biological defects, because of his failure, all totally irrational, will rise. This was the prominent part in his life at the time that he acted.
Do you have an opinion about whether this delusion became so strong that it overtook his ability to make such moral decisions and distinguish between right or wrong by a societal standard?
Correct. He was not able to distinguish between right or wrong. The severe defect in his brain, in his mind, rendered him not capable distinguishing right from wrong by societal standards.
Now, do you, is it not clear that he knew what he was doing was against the law? Do you have an opinion about that?
He knew that what he was doing was illegal, and he attempted to conceal it. He knew that what he was doing was illegal.
And despite the fact that that may be relevant to the analysis of what society thinks is morally right or wrong, do you still think that the psychotic process obviated his ability to distinguish between those moral distinctions?
Correct. The severity and intensity of his psychotic process at that time was so high, was so severe to render him incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
A few more questions, if I may. Did Mr. Holmes tell you that he needed to make the killing impersonal?
Yes, he did.
And is that psychiatrically significant to you?
It is.
Is it, in your opinion, something that was pleasurable for him?
No, it was not.
Is it, in your opinion, strike that. Can you please explain that? What was significant about that?
Is that at times people who kill other people take pleasure in enjoying frightening other people, seeing them, tormenting them during the process, and observing what they do. Mr. Holmes did not want to do that. He did it in the darkness, and was in some of his chats, and what he told me too, is that he didn't want it to be personal. He couldn't have done it if this would have been in the light, if he was able to see the people.
Now, does that mean that he was able to distinguish between right or wrong? Or is it your opinion that he was compelled to do this, that he felt that it must be done, regardless of whether it was something that he found distasteful or not?
Correct. It was more the matter of how it will be done. It had to be done, but how it will be done. The selection more of what is the place and time to do it, but not will it be done. The mission had to be accomplished. So not if it will be done, but how will it be done? How can I say mission accomplished?
Thank you, ma'am. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
All right, cross-examination, please.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
We're going to have to back way up for a little bit to catch up to all this stuff we've just gotten through today. And I want to start back with some of the extra curriculum vitae and experience discussion you had with Mr. King before the end of yesterday, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to follow up with you on is one of the statements you made to Mr. King was you consider yourself an academician, correct?
Correct.
And you do research, correct?
Correct.
And you have generated, by your count, a lot of heavily researched articles, true?
True.
Now, if I have done the math correctly, it seems like you crank out one of those articles, peer-reviewed articles, more than one a month since 1973. Is that fair?
I trust your calculation.
Thank you. That's pretty heavy into the research and writing component of what you do with schizophrenia, fair?
Correct.
Now, one of the other things that we talked about, though, was that your work in the criminal arena has been entirely on behalf of criminal defendants, correct?
Yes.
And frankly, I can't think of an exception, and maybe you'll come up with one for me, but it's been entirely for public defenders. Is that fair?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Go ahead, doctor. Is that right?
If you say so, I mean,
Well, ma'am, it's your background.
yeah, I think that the case of Billiot was not a public defender. It was a law firm in Mississippi, and I don't believe that there were public defenders.
You don't recall.
I don't think there were. I went to a private office.
Now, what's important about that is that even without willful dishonesty, an expert's opinion can be influenced by the side that called for their testimony. You'd agree with that?
It can be influenced, yes.
Right, so you agree with that statement, that even without willful dishonesty, an expert like yourself's opinion can be influenced by the party who called for it.
Go again about the word willful? Even without?
Even without willful dishonesty, an expert's opinion can be influenced by the side that called for their testimony. Fair? You agree with that?
As a general statement, yes. I don't believe it applies to me.
Okay, and the reason I bring it up, of course, is because it was in an article that you and your husband wrote called The Use of Neuroimaging Techniques in Brain Injury. Do you recall that?
What year?
1991, doctor. Do you want to see a copy of it?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to ask me specific questions about it, it will be helpful.
Just that concession, that the side that called you can influence an expert's opinion. If you agree with that, we move on. If you want to see where you wrote it in your article with your husband, I'm happy to show it to you.
Show me.
I think it's been asked and answered at this point.
Yeah,
Overruled.
No, I just want to see the context.
Yes, sure. You may approach the witness, Your Honor.
Yes,
Ma'am,
you
I'm
may.
handing you something. I haven't marked it, but it looks like maybe it's a chapter.
It's a chapter. A chapter is not a refereed paper. I distinguish between, importantly, I distinguish between refereed papers that are subject to, and as I mentioned yesterday, to reviewers going over it, and it's published data supported by the federal government, and to reviews that are asked by people who put a book together that are not related to research.
Anything else that you wanted to say about that, ma'am?
No, show me.
So I'm showing you page 181, and I've just highlighted the line.
Yes.
It's just a sentence in the middle of the paragraph there. Do you see that? Do you agree with that sentence?
May I put it in the context?
Do you agree with the sentence or not? I mean, it's the sentence itself is a standalone sentence. I haven't truncated it, have I?
You have not presented the context of the whole paragraph. And for integrity, it should be presented in the entire context. If you pull out a sentence from what I said and you say without the context, this is not the way that it should be done.
So
I'm sorry about that. This sentence in English say it, but read the 4 lines before it. And it totally distorts this paper. I'm sorry to have to be harsh and say it this way. It talks about a method that we have developed in the early 90s where neuropsychological data is subjected to a careful presentation with computerized program that can show, based on the deficit observed, and here's the picture, just above that, what brain regions might be implicated. So it is not in the eyes of the neuropsychologist who is conducting the study and saying it was 3 points more or 3 points less. And it's because it's to avoid a distortion that can be presented. So for you to say that we have worked several years so hard in order to say that, it's incorrect. I'm sorry.
Anything else you want to say about that, doctor?
I said enough.
Agreed. I want to commit you, though, to that sentence. Even without willful dishonesty, an expert's opinion can be influenced by the side that called for the testimony. Do you agree or disagree with that some 24 years later?
The sentence is correct, but the method, it says that the method that we developed was in order to avoid this general statement. We are trying to overcome it, to bring integrity and consistency in the reports of observations, neuropsychological testing, and everything else. So that's why I added the sentence. Does this sentence appear there? Yes, but it is in order to overcome the method that is this. The rest of the pages in the paper and the figures are to overcome that and not to say, well, this is the state of affairs and this is how it should state. We're in the 21st century.
I understand, but Doctor, the answer to my question is yes. In light of everything you've just added into all that, you still agree that the risk here is that an expert's opinion can be impacted by the side that called it. You agree with that?
And I said that before and just asked to see the context where it said.
Thank you so much. I want to talk to you a little bit before we get into all the stuff you've testified to here about your report and how you generated it and notes. I want to talk to you about the neuroimaging stuff that we put the slides up here on. Okay?
Yes.
Now, you'd agree with me, first off, that those slides, most of those are not created for this case, correct?
The slides were to illustrate a neuroimaging setting and to explain the volumetric measures, the background for how they were obtained for the report provided on Mr. Holmes. It was just the background.
I understand. But the slides themselves were not created to educate this particular jury. They were educated before, they were created before this trial, correct?
Correct.
And they've been used by your husband in several other capital cases across the country to defend clients accused of murder. Fair?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
Overruled.
Go ahead, Doctor.
I'm not familiar and I've not attended or reviewed my husband's presentation in the court. All I review is what we published together, where I put my name on a paper. We have totally separate ways of doing it. So I'm not qualified to let you know if he has used it. We will have to ask him directly.
Okay, so he doesn't have access to these slides?
He has his own set of slides and I have a set of slides. And the slides that I use were created by Dr. Davatsikos, a professor in the Department of Radiology who directs a laboratory for doing them. And this is something that I present in, scientific conferences when I present data. So you are correct, it was not prepared for this jury, but it was background slides that have passed peer review. They've been published before. And I'm using them in order to explain how did we get the numbers of minus almost 3 standard deviation below, etc.
It sounds like the answer to my question is you don't know if your husband's used these in other capital cases across the country.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Now, one of the things that we neuroimaging is that this is not a diagnostic tool for any mental illness, correct?
Correct.
In fact, the DSM-5 that you helped write the chapter on schizophrenia, it does not even list that or the brain structure portions of it as part of the diagnostic criteria at all, right?
Correct. There was extensive discussion on that and the decision that the literature we need to progress in the next few years to see if it can be helpful.
So the answer to my question is...
I said no and added to it a little.
All right, doctor. Wait till he finishes the question, please. You cannot interrupt him, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. All right, go ahead. Ask
Thank
your
you.
question.
Thank you. In part, the reason that it's not used as a diagnostic tool is because it doesn't reach that scientific level of reliability yet for such a purpose. Fair?
Do you want me to say yes or no?
It'd be great.
I will say partly. It's a process. Before you put something as a diagnostic tool, you need many, many studies on thousands of people. It is not MRI, and I said it earlier on and repeated it to you. MRI is not diagnostic, and I did not present it as a diagnostic tool.
The answer to my question is yes, it is not yet scientifically reliable enough to use as a diagnostic tool, right, doctor?
Yes.
Now, in part, that's because this feature that you've described, feature's the wrong term, that this phenomenon that you've described where the neuroimaging of a brain that is slightly different than whatever your control group had been, that has some significant overlap with people who don't have schizophrenia or mental illness, correct?
There is overlap.
Right, and let's talk about what that overlap means. What that overlap means is that somebody can have the exact presentation in the film that you've described that the defendant had earlier this year, and a person can have that presentation in that MRI and never develop schizophrenia, and never develop psychosis, and never develop mental illness. Fair?
No.
They can't.
I understand that you want me to say yes or no. Some of the complexities of the subject matter cannot be answered as yes or no. I can say yes or no, and the information will be meaningless. If you want to proceed this way, that's okay.
Doctor, can somebody have an image of their brain through this MRI process that does show some sort of, I guess what you've described as a slight decrease, and never develop schizophrenia?
Yes, but they will have behavioral abnormalities. We don't scan every person, who walks around. There is a reason to scan people, a clinical reason to scan people. And the likelihood, the statistical probability that somebody will display these specific deficits that are associated with the clinical presentation are close to zero. But it doesn't mean, you have to look at the universe. Do we scan every person? We don't. It's a specific group. Is there overlap between people? There is overlap between people, correct. But the likelihood that people who have this specific presentation will have no problem in life at all is small.
Okay, that's not what I asked you, right? I asked you if someone could have an MRI image like the one you've described but not shown to this jury and never develop schizophrenia. Is the answer yes, or is the answer no?
I don't know.
That sounds pretty indefinite then about this tool. Fair?
No.
It's definitely you don't know.
Because I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm trying to provide information that is scientifically accurate. Namely, MRI is not diagnostic of schizophrenia.
Thank
to
you.
say that nobody with this picture will show schizophrenia, I don't know. I've never seen something like that and followed people and clinically assessed them.
Doctor, did you understand my question to be that nobody that has this presentation will ever develop schizophrenia? Is that what you thought I asked you?
Yeah, if this presentation, does this mean that people who have this presentation must develop schizophrenia? And I say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Some might and some might not.
Some might not, right?
Correct.
And so another reason we can't use it for diagnostic purposes is because of the idea of something called a false positive. You'd agree with that?
Correct. And I said that I'm not using it for diagnostic purposes.
I understand, doctor. They're also not routinely used in clinical psychiatric practice, these MRIs. Fair?
Yes, they're costly.
They are costly. That's correct. The other thing about this particular MRI is, and by the way, you do a lot of neuroimaging, fair?
Correct.
When you got into this case and you saw what you talked about seeing and you went and met with the defendant in December of 2012, you had the opportunity then to say, I think this guy might be schizophrenic. Let's MRI his brain right now to see what's going on. You could have done that.
Yes,
You did not. Fair?
yes,
In fact, you didn't do it in February when you saw him. Fair?
yes,
You didn't do it in May when you saw him. Fair?
yes,
In June of 2013, and we'll get back to the how many hours you spent interviewing him before you did this. In June of 2013, when you declared him to be insane and schizophrenic, you didn't choose to MRI him then. Fair?
yes,
August of 2014, you never chose to MRI him. Correct?
yes,
November of 2014. It's now 2 months before we're going to start jury selection in this case. This trial is set in stone. You didn't MRI him then either, right?
correct.
You chose to seek to get him MRI'd with a result that was released to us the month we started this trial.
Judge, objection, may we approach?
Okay. The objection is overruled.
I'm sorry, may I inquire?
Yes.
Doctor, let's talk a little bit about the test, the MRI test that was done. It was done, to your knowledge, at Parker Adventist Hospital, correct?
Correct.
And one of the other things that becomes a bit of a limitation here is that the machine that was used to take the image a couple months ago was a 1.5 Tesla machine, correct?
Correct.
Well, let's call that, for sake of argument, the VHS of video, okay? Because when that image gets read by the clinical radiologist who's on scene there, Dr. Olson, you remember him?
Yes.
And he said, I see nothing. There's nothing there, correct?
Correct.
That image then gets sent to you out in Pennsylvania, correct?
Correct.
And you guys use the Blu-ray DVD player of Tesla machines, right? You use a 3 Tesla tricked out, super expensive, high def kind of machine, correct?
In our setting, yes.
Yeah. So you're using, in essence, and you tell me if this analogy is wrong, a Blu-ray DVD player to interpret an image from what I've called the VHS. Is that fair?
I would object to the characterization as confusing.
Overruled.
Go ahead, doctor.
I'm not sure about the analogy. I don't know how to answer it.
Okay.
About
Let me try something different then. You are using a super sensitive machine relative to the one that actually captured the image, correct? If that question is unclear, ask me. I'll give it another shot.
I think that I understand what I just want to explain.
Yeah,
that,
go ahead.
if I may,
Sure,
is that the images that we obtained on a 3 Tesla for the healthy people, the comparison group, were done on a higher level Tesla machine compared to the one where they were obtained in Colorado, in the hospital in Colorado.
I get it.
If anything, so there are 2 points that if I may make.
Mm-hmm.
One, there's an extensive literature that compares volumetric brain regions measures obtained in 1.5 and in 3 Tesla machines. And are relatively, when you look about volume differences, comparable. There are programs that are designed to do that. Furthermore, I would have expected less of a decrease in the brain volume to show under what I will use as an analogy, if I may, as a camera of high caliber camera or under higher magnification compared to lower magnification. So we see the lower volume in specific brain regions are on the lower magnification camera. They're evident there, and the program accounts for it. So all I'm saying is that the volumetric measures that were obtained show specific decrease in brain volume, and that it's not diagnostic. And to go back to the question you asked me, why did we do it? Why didn't I do it when I started? Because I was relying on the psychiatric information. And it was the CT scan that was made available to me later on. Not that long before the MRI scan that showed some dilatation of the ventricle. I said, small amount. And the CT scan is not optimal because of beam hardening effects compared to MRI. And therefore I said, let's see, not for diagnostic purposes, let's see, and this is a small report compared to everything else, let's see what the MRI shows. I did not predict the results of the MRI and presented them not as a diagnostic tool, but when you investigate brain and behavior, I was looking at the brain, it's not diagnostic. I did not discuss Mr. Holmes, the diagnosis of Mr. Holmes, based on the MRI, and I did not suggest it for it to be done earlier because that's not how I diagnose people. I agree with you, it's a scientific tool. It's not in the DSM. That's all. It's almost a comma in the entire thing. That's all.
It sounds, doctor, like the answer to my question is yes, we used a much more sensitive machine to try to read a far less sensitive MRI image that we received from Porter. Is that accurate?
No. We used a more sensitive machine for the study of the healthy people because these are only the machines that we have. So the data on the 79 comparison or healthy people controls was on a sensitive machine. But you can integrate data because at many sites there's a 1.5 Tesla. You can integrate data for comparison, and it's done even in research. It's called harmonization of data. The algorithm for calculating the volume adapts to the machine obtained. But I think almost we're making too much out of it. I did not, was just illustrating the application of MRI. I did not make the diagnosis based on MRI.
It looks like, too, it's probably such a sensitive finding with this 3 Tesla machine. I mean, it's not something we could see. Is that right?
Based on the clinical MRI that the neuroradiologist looked at, no. And I've shown on a 3T machine that the neuroradiologist at Penn will call something normal, but with quantitative refined measures, you can see differences. This needs to be further developed. It's a scientific research tool published in refereed paper.
And the outcome of that analysis is that it was a slight difference, a slight change. Fair?
Well, 2 standard deviation is not so slight.
I was looking at the words that were used in the reports.
The ventricles was slight, correct. The volumetric measures, the quantitative, was significant.
Sure. Thank you. Now, is it fair to say that had we done one of those in December of 2012, that we would have a better chance of identifying how long this brain has been like that in relation to July the 20th, 2012? You'd agree with that, right?
Yes.
So, but when we do it in April of 2015, just a few months ago, it is speculative. I mean, just looking at the brain to know when that change, if there was even a change, occurred, right?
Correct, and if I may, I can add what we know, but I will leave it up to you.
I got to be honest, Mr. King's going to get up here and ask you a ton more questions, probably at this pace tomorrow or next week. I want to ask you, though, if we'd had 2 MRIs, maybe one that you did in December 2012 and then one that you did a couple months ago, that would give us an even better indication of what changes may or may not be taking place in the defendant's brain, correct?
Correct.
We didn't do any of that, right?
Correct.
Thank you. So, when you are, hold on, a little talk about schizophrenia just to put things in perspective. You would agree that right now the estimate is about 1% of the American population has schizophrenia.
Yes.
That's like 3.6 million people, isn't it?
Yes.
And by your own estimations, and not just yours, but the industry, maybe 50% or more of those people are untreated and unmedicated, correct?
Intermittently.
Okay. But about 50%?
About. I said intermittently.
And I'm going to do simple math. 1.8 million-ish people are intermittently untreated and unmedicated?
Yes.
And you would agree that not everyone, and you talked about genetic risk, not everyone at genetic risk for schizophrenia gets it, correct?
Correct.
In fact, the numbers go down quite a bit from the immediate family out to other family members, correct?
Correct.
And there are no immediate family members of the defendant that have schizophrenia, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, if other extended family members, like grandparents, aunts, uncles, have some sort of psychotic or schizo spectrum disorder, that's not only an increase that someone might get schizophrenia, but it could indicate schizotypal personality disorder, an increased incidence of that for someone, correct?
It might.
When you were asked to take on this case, you insisted, and rightfully so, but you insisted on coming out and doing interviews of the defendant so that you could do some sort of neuropsychiatric assessment. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, there was some talk with you and Mr. King about video. Do you remember that? Video? Taking a video of the interviews? Do you recall talking to Mr. King about that?
No.
You don't recall an exchange where he said, hey, don't you like to do videos? And you said, take it or leave it, and it never came up. You don't remember any of that exchange? Did I just delusional think that?
Your Honor, maybe we should clarify that he's talking about the testimony today as opposed to a conversation that we had in the past.
I can rephrase.
All right, go
Good.
ahead.
Did you understand that my question was about earlier today, like a few hours ago, you and Mr. King had a conversation about whether to video the interviews you did with the defendant?
Today? Yes.
Oh, okay.
I thought you were talking in the past. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry. And you remember that conversation, right?
I hope so.
Yes?
Yes, I hope so.
Okay. And one of the things you said was, hey, look, we do some videos back at University of Pennsylvania, but I could kind of take it or leave it, depending upon who the person is. Do you recall that?
I'm not sure I used the word taking to
No,
leave it,
you
but
sure didn't.
yeah, but that's the gist of it.
One of the things that was brought up, though, was in this case of Billiot, Mr. Billiot. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you videotaped both of your interviews, didn't you?
Yes.
In fact, one of the things that you said in your testimony in that case, which was not your testimony as to his sanity, but his competency to be executed, was commonly, I videotape my interviews. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And I was delighted that this was done in this case, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you use the term delighted, it makes it seem like it's better to videotape. Is that not what you meant by delighted?
I'm not sure. I thought that it was a good idea to do it. All of the witnesses were interviewed. It was set up this way. There was a room for it, and I accepted it. I was happy that it's done. I felt comfortable interviewing people in front of a camera.
Right. And in fact, you adopt your interview style to the setting and the person when you do it on video, correct?
I try. You're talking about Mr. Billiot?
I'm
or
talking
other,
about
other cases?
Anytime you do it, you adopt your interview, you adopt the setting and your interview to the setting and the time available to videotape someone for the interview. Is that fair?
Again, I can't answer just with yes or no. I'm sorry. And if you give me 2 sentences, I'll be able to say that. What I said today, earlier, and I believe that the record shows it, is that clinically, people who come clinically with schizophrenia, we do not interview. We interview people with permission of the treating physician who are considered for participation in research, are clinically stable, sign informed, and I said that the clinical care comes first, sign consent to participate in research, and then for training purposes, especially when we use new instruments and we need to establish reliability, I do it more frequently. Our entire center does it and trains together, but not for a patient who comes in for care with schizophrenia. It will not be helpful to videotape a patient at the time.
And again, to be clear, you never ever thought you were coming out here to treat the defendant for anything, right?
Correct.
You knew that whatever it was you were going to do had the potential to end up showing up in a place just like this at a time just like now, correct?
Yes.
And what videotape would have done, and Mr. King used the phrase, would have perfected the record, but I want to ask you some specifics. What that video would have done would have captured immediately after this episode, whatever it was in November of 2012, the way he presented, correct?
Yes.
It would have kept us from having to have conversations about the details and the efficacy of your note-taking, your report writing, which we are surely going to do. It would have kept us from having to do that, correct?
Part of it.
And these people would have been able to see what we saw with Dr. Reed's 22 hours of how he answers, as well as the precise words that he uses in response to the precise questions that are asked, correct?
Yes.
But you didn't do that, right?
Right.
You talked to the defense about it, correct?
I do not recall that we had discussions of should I, or should it be videotaped?
Do you remember having a conversation over a phone with me and with an investigator named Mike Heelan from the district attorney's office with Mr. King on the phone? You remember that?
I remember that you called, yeah?
Yep. And do you remember during that conversation we talked about this same video topic? You remember that?
Yes.
And you had said you recalled, you thought, that you had had a conversation
A brief exchange.
I got it. After the brief exchange, who made the decision not
might be difficult, and that it will be helpful if I just see him without the camera.
That was December of 2012.
This was December 19th, 2012.
Tell us about the camera you used then for February of 2013.
I did not use camera after that as well. I did not.
May 2013?
No. There was no video recording of any of the sessions.
Not November?
No, there was not taking with quotation of words that he used, but there were no video recording.
And that was a decision that you made. Fair?
I did not request that it will be done.
After the December interview, you did not seek to have it recorded after that.
Correct.
And so when you make that decision, you've made that decision not just for you, but you've made that decision for everybody who's going to review what you did in the case, correct?
Correct. I thought that my verbal report, written notes obtained, and being under oath, I will portray accurately all the information that I've obtained during the interview.
Okay, so what that leaves us with are your notes from each of the settings, correct?
Yes.
So I want to talk to you about those notes. When you go and sit down with the defendant on December 19th, 2012, are you writing down the notes while he's talking, or do you write them down after the session is over?
So for the first session, I did not write the notes while he was talking. I was observing him, and as soon as I left the room in the jail, in the waiting area, before being picked up, I wrote the notes. For the other sessions, I was writing while he was talking.
Okay, so that I'm clear and the record's clear. Every session after December 19, 2012, you took what we're going to call contemporaneous notes with the statements being made, correct?
Not through, for some of the sessions, not throughout the entire session, not word by word that he was saying. For some of them, when new material or was covering it again, like for the August 5th session, it was more word by word that of what he was saying, which slowed us down. But for some of the session, it was, after the first 2 hours and then less, and finishing up as soon as I left the session.
Okay, so for February now, February of 2013, the second time that you come see him, did you take notes while you talked with him, or did you?
For part of it.
How did you make the decision when to take notes and when not to take notes?
I'd with me the writing material, and just depending on how much information he was providing and how much attention I had to pay to him. Because taking notes is, takes an effort, and that's why sometimes usually my handwriting is clearer. It's just doing it very fast, missing some letters, and having, just moving it forward, rapidly.
I'm sorry.
So I cannot tell you, if this is your question, at what minute. I can tell you when I started the interview and when the interview was over, but I cannot tell you that at this point I wrote down and at this point I stopped writing. There's no recording of it. So I'm telling you that overall, after the first session, I had written material that I could write with, and that I wrote depending on his demeanor, what I was asking, was it something new, am I repeating it 3-4 times? Many of the questions I repeated 3-4-5 times during the interview in order to get at it at different ways. So I did not write word by word. It just was not feasible.
Okay, and so then after the session, let's say February of 2013, immediately after or shortly after, you would sit back down with your notes and fill in sort of what you hadn't written down at the time that it was said, correct?
I will not fill in. Whatever I didn't write during the session itself, I will write thereafter.
You'll write at the end of the notes, bless you. You'll write at the end of the notes.
Yeah.
And shortly after, correct?
Shortly after.
Here's why that becomes important, right, to do that. Because you cannot be expected to remember quotes and the details of interviews many months later when you finally sit down to write your report, right?
When writing the report, my written notes were in front of me. And in fact, if you look at the report, you will see that many of the quotations and words are from, it's the same sentences, from my written notes.
Doctor, I feel like you mistook my question.
Okay.
You want to be as detailed as you think necessary to get down the things that were said in the session, either at the time that you hear them or shortly thereafter, because you must rely upon your notes for the report you will generate, in some cases, many months later. Fair?
Yes.
And those notes reflect your best recollection of that setting at the time. You can't be expected to remember what was said 4 or 5 months before when you sit down in June to knock out a report in this case, right?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that you do is you write the report after you have done all the interviews that you're going to do, correct?
Yes.
And so for that first report that you generated in June of 2013, you had sat down with the defendant on 4 separate occasions over 3 days, correct?
Yes.
One was that December 19th, 2012, yes?
Yes.
2 times on February 9th, 2013, is that fair?
Yes.
And then once on May the 2nd, not May the 1st, is that fair? May the 2nd, 2013?
I've written May 1st, but I might have been... No, it's May the 2nd, correct. I flew out on May the 1st, and I saw him on May the 2nd in the morning. Correct.
Okay, and you ended up generating your report on June 17th, 2013, correct?
Correct.
7 months, is that 6 months or 7 months after you first saw the, wait a minute. 6 months after you first saw the defendant, correct?
Yes.
Now, Mr. King asked you to tell us the total number of hours that you spent before you came here to testify today in your process. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you said 28 hours, right?
28 hours, yes.
But to be accurate, that June 2013 report, by the time you generated that, you had spent only 13 hours with the defendant. Fair?
For the first report, yes.
And in that first report, you had already declared him to be schizophrenic, yes?
Yes.
And insane, yes?
Yes.
After 13 hours, correct?
Yes.
Let's talk about the things that you didn't have to consider before you declared him insane, all right? And we'll go through your report in whatever detail the next 10 minutes will let us have, and then we'll keep at it tomorrow, okay?
Okay.
Now, you list a section here called Materials Reviewed. Do you see that? It's number 2 on there.
Yes.
And your statement is very, well, in large part general. You'd agree with that.
Yes.
I have reviewed the medical, psychiatric, other institutional records, and relevant portions of the discovery materials related to Mr. Holmes that have been created. Correct?
Yes.
Such materials include school reports, investigation interview records, a review of video records at the Arapahoe County Jail, as well as written jail records. Correct?
Yes.
And then you say Mr. Holmes' notebook. See that?
Yes.
So you had that before you wrote your report in June of 2013.
I reviewed it briefly, as I said. I believe I said it, that I reviewed it briefly when I first met the defense team. I did not have it with me, but I reviewed it briefly. I think I obtained it later.
Hold on. They showed you a copy when you met with them before you interviewed the defendant in December of 2012? Yes?
Yes.
When did they give you a copy that you could actually use with the defendant?
I do not remember the date, but I can check my records on that.
Yeah, take a look.
It was later on.
Was it after you had opined on his insanity and schizophrenia?
I'm not sure about that. I need a date. I think it was before.
What can you take a look at that will tell us when you were finally given a copy of that important notebook?
I'm not sure that I have it here. It might be on the thumb that was provided by the defense, and when I don't have with me the thumbs. But I can check and provide information tomorrow. I don't have the thumb.
That's an agreement. Thank you for looking into that, and we'll get that answer from you tomorrow.
Okay.
Is it your recollection, though, even if we don't know the exact date, you were aware of the existence of this journal, this workbook, notebook that the defendant created and mailed right before he engaged in this crime? You were aware of it and had actually seen it, fair?
Yes.
My guess is you would have insisted, listen, I don't want to opine on sanity or mental disease or defect until I've had the chance to sit down with this guy and go line by line through this important notebook, right?
I think that I had sufficient information from reviewing the notebook and from the interview with him and the other records in the first report to opine with some degree of medical certainty. And then I followed up with other interviews and gone over the notebook with him and reviewed the reports that were obtained by other medical professionals, and it was consistent with it. Put differently, if in the following months, based on all the information available, I would have concluded that the first report or the first opinion provided was inaccurate, I would have said so.
It sounds like the answer to my question is you may have generated this report and these opinions without physically having the notebook to sit down and go over with the defendant. Does that sound right?
I think I had the notebook and I said that I will check, but I've gone over it with the defendant. I have also the date for that, but I don't on the thumb, but I don't have it here. I didn't bring it into the court. And I will check on it and will provide you the information tomorrow morning.
Okay. That sounds like a pretty important piece of information though, doesn't it? Yes?
It might be. I'm not...
Notebook. The notebook's
The notebook is important, yes.
The other thing is that June 17th opinion, June 17th, 2013 opinion of insanity and schizophrenia, that wasn't some deadline you were given by which you had to generate an opinion, correct?
I was asked to write the report.
Who asked you to write the they gave you, right? Or that's what they told you, right? Correct?
That's what they gave me, yes.
Yeah, okay. So you don't know what the defense had. You know what you were given. Fair?
But I requested to have all the information that is available. And I assume that they did not withheld information from me.
Let's talk about other information that's out there that you would have wanted to get before you opined, okay? For instance, interviews with family members. That's information you would have wanted to get firsthand, correct?
With family members of Mr. Holmes?
Yeah, not mine.
Yeah, okay. I got information from the defense on that, but I did not have a chance to interview them. Notably, the information that I got directly from them was consistent with the information that I got from the defense team.
Okay. The answer to my question is, it is important to you to interview the family members of someone who you are going to opine about whether or not they have schizophrenia or some psychosis or something, correct?
It is important. Yes, it is.
Yeah. It's so important that in 2 books that you've written, one called Me, Myself, and Them, and one called If Your Adolescent Has Schizophrenia, you say it is important to interview family members of the person who may be schizophrenic. Do you recall that?
I wrote the book, but may I elaborate just like we did before? His family members,
Doctor,
his parents were not aware of what was going on, and I knew that. They did not know anything about him. He never anything except, him growing up and what I described earlier on. He did not share with them any of the psychotic processes that he was undergoing. He was guarded. They were as surprised as all of us by what happened.
And by the way, wholly inconsistent with why you say you want to interview family members about people who are potentially schizophrenic. You say in these books it is important to get their observations of the defendant or of the schizophrenic person, right? Correct?
Yes.
You did not interview them before you opined on his schizophrenia, correct?
I obtained information from...
Honest to
I
goodness.
did not interview them.
That's right.
But I obtained and read information on the interview of information obtained by the defense, and it was consistent with my direct evaluation of them.
Doctor,
Hold on.
Yeah.
I can't have you speaking over each other. You need to answer his question. Mr. Kim will have an opportunity and redirect later to ask further questions of you. Right now, he's asking you a yes or no question. And so you need to answer just the question. All right? Repeat the question. And then one at a time.
Doctor, you did not talk with the parents before writing your written report opining that he was schizophrenic and he was insane, correct?
Yes,
And that is not the standard practice you advocate for, nor that you typically follow, correct?
yes,
In fact, you just told us that you read reports of interviews. Do you recall just saying that before the judge came in? You remember saying that?
yes.
That's not what happened, at least according to your report, right? I'll read it to you. You tell me if I'm wrong. Oral accounts of interviews with family members. You see that?
Well,
Right after where it says Mr. Holmes' notebook, comma, oral accounts of interviews with family members, teachers, and students as related by the defense team. Do you see that?
yes.
Yeah, okay.
The,
You were not provided written reports to review. They told you what they got from these family members, correct? Yes? Doctor, if you don't
No.
remember, let me know.
no, I remember, but it's hard for me to answer, understand, and respect the court, yes or no, when there is more to it. But I will just,
Listen, Doctor, did you receive from the defense, contrary to what is written in your own report, written reports that they did with family members?
notes that what they've done, and of interviews with family members, teachers, students. Yes, summary, brief notes of what they've done, as well as oral discussion. The oral is the part of them talking to the family members and to the teachers. They interviewed them and provided me with summary and oral on the information that they obtained.
They did.
The defense team.
Right. Now, one of the things that we asked you about during the conversation we were permitted to have with you about this was you didn't seek to interview them yourself in December of 2012, fair?
Yes,
In February of 2013, fair?
yes,
May of 2013, fair?
yes,
Or prior to generating your report, fair?
yes.
Correct? You were not told, hey, don't call them. Correct?
No,
You wanted to, right?
yes,
It mattered enough that 2 months prior to us starting jury selection, then and only then did you sit down with them to have a conversation about their son. Fair?
this is when it was possible in the schedule.
So that I'm clear, so that we're all clear. After December of 2012, it was only 23 months later that your schedule permitted you to sit down with the parents of this guy after you had written a report already opining on his insanity and schizophrenia. Is that accurate?
Yes, but it's not just my schedule. It's their schedule of coming out, a meeting here, or flying to California. So it's not like...
23 months, right? Your Honor, it's now a good time to take a break and we'll come back
Yes,
tomorrow.
we'll adjourn for the day. All right, members of the jury, please make sure that you comply with all my admonishments related to your conduct when you're not in the courtroom. I'll see you all tomorrow morning at the usual time, 8:40. Get some rest tonight. Thank you. All right, the record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Have a good evening, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow morning. The court will be in recess. Thank you.
Please rise.